Hello and welcome to the Week 4 Supplemental Lecture on Hilary Rose's Hand, Brain and Heart, a Feminist Epistemology for the Natural Sciences. To remind again of the term epistemology, which we discussed in the common lecture for this week, and epistemology is our study of how we know what we know. It is our theory about why we have the beliefs and the knowledge that we have, and it's also a theory that binds together our sense of the relationship between those beliefs and reality, of whatever we think is out there in the world. And Rose is one of several people that you could read this week who's going to be arguing that there's something that distorts the forms of knowing in the conventional sciences. She's particularly concerned with the sexual division of labor, and that's mainly what she'll talk about in this piece. And she believes that the distortion that arises from that sexual division of labor, that has its own effect on the division of labor within the sciences, distorts the sorts of knowledges the sciences can have in ways that are dangerous and damaging not just for women but for society as a whole. So she starts off talking about the stakes, and this kind of opening statement is quite common in pieces from this period, in the same way that opening statements that talk about global warming and fears of environmental disaster might be very prevalent in pieces starting today. She talks about the fear of nuclear annihilation. She says this paper starts from the position that the attitudes dominant within science and technology must be transformed, for their telos is nuclear annihilation. Okay. Then she refers back to an older set of critiques of division of labor and the ways that the division of labor affects scientific productions. And she says those older critiques focus on the division between mental and manual labor, the fact that we're a society where certain people make their living with their heads, so to speak, based on their ideas, and other people make their living with their hands, with manual labor. And she likes this earlier critique. She's going to draw from it, but she thinks that there was another massive issue in the division of labor that the earlier critique doesn't attend to, which is the sexual division of labor, that divides off the sexes and allocates to women what she calls the caring labor of the heart. So caring functions and operations within society tend to be gender specialized or sex specialized. And this systematically excludes women from certain forms of production, including the production of scientific knowledge. She says, transcendence of this division of labor, set up among hand, brain, and heart, makes possible a new scientific knowledge and technology that will enable humanity to live in harmony rather than antagonism with nature, including human nature. The necessity and magnitude of the task must be recognized. So the claim on the table is that if you can overcome a particular division of labor, if you can stop segregating women and men and mental and manual labor, if you can distribute labor more equitably, then you'll achieve a particular harmony, that there's something about the division of labor that's causing adverse impacts for nature. It's a very controversial kind of claim, and we'll explore the argument she makes for it. So she says, there's an existing critique of science and technology, but it's tended to focus on the way in which science and technological development are tied to capitalism and imperialism. And she says that the outcome of this critique is what she calls an antipathy to science that rejects all scientific investigation carried out under any conditions at any historical time. Her language indicates she thinks there's another kind of critique possible that perhaps could suggest the potential for a new kind of science rather than just anti-science. Okay, so she's not trying to chuck out everything. She is trying to reconstruct the basis for a different kind of science under different historical conditions. She says feminism takes up from here, but tries to extend the insights of this earlier critique to look at the relation of science and technology with patriarchy. She says this is a relatively new line of theory. She says that protests against science have tended to come from women who were outside the scientific field. The costs were too high for the few women who managed to make it inside. The topic's also not something she regards as historically central to feminism. She says there are a few early works, but otherwise it's either rejected or ignored. But in the 1970s, a new wave of what she calls biological determinism has forced the feminist movement to think quite seriously about scientific issues and how it's going to approach them. She says, doing biology is thus no longer seen as hostile, but as helpful to women's interests, and increasingly it is possible to go forward from this essentially defensive purpose to the much more positive goal of seeking to show how a feminist knowledge of the natural world offers an emancipatory rather than an exterminatory science. So again, this idea that if you do something to do away with the gender division of labor, if you incorporate women more fully into scientific production, you're going to be able to shift the consequences of that production from things that threaten life to things that are preserving of it. This is a sort of not quite a separate spheres argument, not quite the notion that sort of women have their own intrinsic specialization. She'll be critical of what she calls biological essentialism later, but it is the notion that when you have this division of labor, when you are systematically making one gender engage in labor of the heart or empathic labor, you are excluding that kind of empathic orientation within the other spheres of labor. Okay, so it's not an argument that women are innately a particular way, but it's an argument that a particular sex division of labor channels particular human potentials into certain spheres of social life and takes them out of others. And so she says the goal is to move toward a feminist natural science. This is the sort of thing, it spills over into the newspapers even now. It's a real red rag to the bull kind of statement. And you can think about it in light of some of the more sort of standard mainstream definitions of science we also look at this week. What would it mean in terms of those definitions to start talking about a feminist natural science rather than science as such, or a neutral science or something like that? She says the exclusion of women from science produces a specific kind of science. She thinks it is exterminatory, that it is forms of abstraction are involved in it that are destructive. But a new kind of science is possible, being developed through the feminist movement, that can overcome those tendencies. And then she talks about the radical critics of science. Okay, she says that there are two lines of analysis here, one of which, the political economic analysis of science, she thinks is fairly coherent and fairly well developed. But there's another line of analysis around science and ideology that she thinks is more difficult and more incomplete. She says one of the difficulties is that there is an earlier socialist and Marxist optimism about science. There is the belief that science and technology develop productive forces that would lead to the overcoming of capitalism. So there's an expectation that science is worst case neutral. It can be used by different kinds of societies, but best case it might be a progressive force, an emancipatory force. And she's one of several authors this week that refers to something called the Lysenko Affair, which is a Soviet attempt to develop a specifically proletarian science. So if you're talking about developing a feminist science, you've got to worry about this comparison. Lysenko's essentially a fraud. He has what would be known as a Lamarckian genetic theory, the idea that organisms can develop traits during their lifetimes and pass those acquired characteristics down through their offspring. So it is in opposition to Darwinian genetics, to Mendelian genetics, that understands traits to be embodied in genes and passed along that way. And the Lysenko Affair involves the sort of outright execution or imprisonment in labor camps of Soviet scientists who agree with the Mendelian conception of genetics, and it also distorts what kind of science can be done in a Soviet Union for a period of time. So she's got to raise it, because this attempt to develop a proletarian science led to bad consequences, destructive consequences. And so when you're talking about developing a feminist science or any other kind of qualified science, any other kind of science that's meant to reflect the perspectives of a particular group, the question's got to be asked whether you're just going to lead to similar kind of nonsense or destruction or something that's damaging to science itself. And she says that Marxist scholarship has responded to this issue by shrinking from analyzing the circumstances and implications of this failed cultural revolution. It's retreated to the position that there's only one science, by implication, bourgeois science. Okay, so she's denying the idea that it retreats to only one science and that can be neutral science. Your science is always situated somewhere. So if we've got one science today, it's going to be the science of a particular perspective, and she's going to argue that perspective has class and gender implications. So the 1960s movements reject the optimism in science, and they reject it because of historical experiences at the time. She says what the 60s radicals discovered in their campaigns against an abused, militarized, and polluting science was that those in charge of neutral science were overwhelmingly white, male, and privileged occupants of positions in advanced industrial society. The anti-human technologies that science generated were being used for the profit of some and the distress of many. Okay, so science does not look in the 60s to the movements that she's interested in as though it is a progressive force at all. It looks like it is providing power to those who already possess great power, and it is causing a great deal of suffering. And then she talks about a series of people that she thinks begin to question what she calls the myth of scientific neutrality, and she mentions Kuhn, whom some of you may have read this week, as representing the beginnings of the thaw. People who are less friendly to a position like the one Rose is putting forward also often see Kuhn as the beginning of all of this stuff and think that he's just led to a huge disaster by opening up the possibility for looking at historical conditions for scientific knowledge. Kuhn himself will argue back against those. It'll be a good paper if someone wants to dig into that. She talks about another figure of Etz, and she says that rather than asking what science is in some philosophical sense, it turns the analysis to what do scientists actually do. Okay, go out and look and examine what they do in practice. Feyerabend does something similar. He says you need to look at what people are actually doing. And she says that what this research shows is that there is a shift during the period that we think of as the period from classical to modern science. There's a shift from what she calls craft to industrial production. So industrial production requires large-scale research and substantial amounts of capital, and it tends to be hierarchically managed from above, big research teams working under someone's direction, and that this is quite different from an early artisanal or craft production of science around the time that classical conceptions of science first emerge, where lots of individuals with very little capital are able to make meaningful contributions without having to be organized in some sort of big research project. The argument is that industrialization is what renders science uncritical, and Revetz calls for the deinstitutionalization of science as a result. So do away with the large-scale production and go back to artisanal production. Rose is not too impressed with this. She calls it an essentially romantic and libertarian political response. She says that it would deprive critical forms of science of access to meaningful means of production. Okay, so she is not herself opposed to large-scale science. She's not opposed to substantial capital investments and people working in research teams. What she's going to object to is where the people come from and how the division of labor that results in those teams operates. And then she talks about a set of radical critics, and again she hits on something that is part of a growing critical reaction at the time, so she's by no means the only person saying this. She says radical critics are revolted by the genocidal science that the United States employed in the war in Southeast Asia, and by the expanding new technologies of urban repression at home. Okay, so she's talking about the war in Vietnam. She's talking about urban riots and the way that they were suppressed. And the question might be, from where we stand historically, why is science being blamed for this? And some of that actually has to do with the way in which the US governments in the period articulated themselves. They wanted to recruit the best and the brightest. They understood themselves as progressive and scientific and promoting of technologies. And you have quite dramatic technological achievements. Okay, so you've got people on the moon. So there's an association of science and the aura and the patina of science around governments in the period in the US that causes this association of criticisms of what the government is doing, criticisms of its military actions and its domestic repressions, with criticisms of science itself. Rose says the radical critics asked, how can science claim to be ideologically pure, value-free, and above all neutral, when even a well-regarded text entitled The Scientific Method offers as an example of scientific development the making and testing of napalm on a university playing field, without any references to ethical or political problems? So science in this period is looking a little too willing to be in the service of political goals, whatever those goals may be. Okay, so it looks very instrumentally rational, to use Weber's terminology, but it's not exercising judgment over the means, the ends to which its rationality is being directed. And then she talks about what she calls a new political economy of science that is critical of knowledge being turned into a commodity. And she says this new political economy is built on the recognition that scientific knowledge is no longer timeless, but has value only at a particular time and a particular place. Okay, and again, this is something that a lot of people see Kuhn as opening the way to, and then it's carried much, much further by subsequent critical studies of science. And a variety of things are paid attention to by the new political economy of science. There's the sort of extension of patents over things that you used not to be able to patent. There are extremely important economic implications to who has priority of publication. And there's an inequality of knowledge between core and periphery. And these are some of the things that Bourdieu talks about this week as well. And she says this process of commodification and industrialization of knowledge is accompanied by the exclusion of women. She says feminist theory has largely succeeded in artisanal spaces, in the social sciences and in humanities, where very little sort of physical capital, very little money is required to make contributions in those areas, but women have been excluded, and therefore feminist theory is not well developed in these more industrialized academic sectors. And then she talks about alienated knowledge, and she refers to a group of people called the Frankfurt School and to a figure named Alfred Sohn-Rathel, who is someone who analyzes the division between mental and manual labor in order to try to figure out why current forms of philosophy have such abstract categories and why current forms of science have what he would regard as an alienated character. And his analysis involves looking at, on the one hand, the rise of money economies. So he thinks there's certain kinds of conceptual abstractions that just come from money in circulation, and that you can see this in classical antiquity. But he also focuses on the division between mental and manual labor, and he thinks that categories of thought becomes much more abstract when you've got a form of class domination, such that in order to do mental labor at all, you're sitting in a very privileged and therefore very removed place in society. And at the time that Sohn-Rathel writes, he has great hopes for the Cultural Revolution in China. Rose is critical of those and thinks they're problematic, but she thinks it's important to sustain the hope that some sort of revolution, that some sort of transformation could overcome some of the problematic division of labor that Sohn-Rathel is hoping can be overcome. She says, in a world where the alienation of science and technology confronts us in the pollution of the seas, the cities, the countryside, and in the fear of nuclear holocaust, such a longing cannot be dismissed as merely romantic. Its realization may rather be a guarantor of our survival. Okay, so there's something in the hope of Sohn-Rathel's work that she wants to carry forward, even though she's not going to agree with its political analysis. But on a theoretical level, she says the difficulty with this critique is that it's sex-blind. So it's not because the people offering this kind of critique are personally insensitive or personally sexist. She notes that a number of them actually personally have been involved in struggles for women's equality. She says the problem is with the theoretical categories themselves. They're not capable of accounting for sexual division of labor in science. They don't thematize it. All they've got is the mental manual labor distinction. And so the significance of patriarchy is missed. And where then patriarchy is noticed, or where the sexual sort of division of labor is noticed, it's not treated in terms of being a division of labor. It's treated as a result of ideology, of prejudice, of discrimination of that sort, rather than analyzing material factors, or what she calls the interests of men in subordinating women. So she thinks it's possible to do a more materialist analysis of these phenomena, and talks about feminism as a kind of materialism, where materialism is a term that is historically associated with Marxist critiques and with looking at political economic issues. She says that materialism, when it gives priority to production, tacitly aligns the reproduction of human life with just the production of stuff. But reproduction, the reproduction of other human beings, is also a material necessity. So previous forms of materialism are too one-sided for Rose. You need a more comprehensive kind of materialism that, yes, is going to look at how we meet our physical needs, but is also going to look at reproduction and bring that into the category of things that we do to reproduce ourselves as a whole. She says it's not by chance the movement has been concerned with abortion, birth control, sexuality, housework, childcare, indeed with all those matters that had been trivialized into silence in the long period since an earlier wave of feminism. Feminism tends to be categorized in waves. She's part of what would be the second wave of feminism. The first one being some of the readings that we took a look at in our social movements handout the other week. She talks about the sexual division of labor in the household, and particularly the way in which forms of working that require emotional labor or personal service, whether they're paid or unpaid, tend to get associated with women. They tend to be feminized spheres. She says, perhaps to make the nature of this caring, intimate, emotionally demanding labor clear, we should use the ideologically loaded term love. For without love, without close interpersonal relationships, human beings, and it would seem especially small human beings, cannot survive. This emotionally demanding labor requires that women give something of themselves to the child, to the man. The production of people is thus qualitatively different from the production of things. It requires caring labor, the labor of love. And she says, Sohn-Rathel, for all of his good intentions, takes this sexual division of labor for granted. He talks about emancipatory possibilities, but they're still in the space of the production of commodities, as though if we emancipated ourselves by undoing the division of mental and manual labor, we would have overcome all of the problems that were confronting science and its alienated nature. She says, these sorts of theories seek the unity of hand and brain, but exclude the heart. And then she makes some qualifications. You've got to be careful, she says, not to essentialize and think that women are innately more caring. So there is work that requires care. Women are the ones tasked with doing that work in our societies, but that work could in fact be distributed, Rose is suggesting, more equitably. So it's not that women are naturally this way and that that's how the labor therefore follows naturally. This is a division of labor, and it could be divided in other ways, in the same way that the mental manual labor distinction, she thinks, could be divided in other ways. She says the problem for materialists is to admit biology, that is constrained essentialism, while giving priority to social construction, without concluding at the same time that human beings are infinitely malleable. Okay, and these are debates that will pop back up again during the term. So you've got two one-sided possibilities. You've got the possibility that people are totally determined by their biology, other than in sort of fairly inconsequential aspects of themselves, and then you've got a radical social construction that says that people are a blank slate and can become anything that we socialize them into being. She thinks the materialist response is not to do either of those extreme things, but to talk about the fact that biology has an impact, it is influential, to be aware of the fact that we may not know how and to what extent it is influential, to be open to the possibility that there's high levels of plasticity, and that we can therefore change social institutions. We should not assume they're based on nature. But it doesn't mean that people are infinitely re-socializable into new forms. And then she talks a little bit about the history and development of the concept of the family wage, which is a concept around which you get a lot of labor mobilization and a lot of social consensus during the early to mid parts of the 20th century. And she says this is an intrinsically male-centered concept, even in situations where women are the primary income earners. You have a largely segregated labor market. And she says the only time this is really successfully overcome is during the big world wars, when there's such a shortage of male labor that women pour in to make up the deficit, but then immediately pour back out when the men return. And that it's been very, very difficult to make a dent in the sexual division of labor outside of those times of extreme scarcity of labor. She says science as a production system in miniature faithfully reflects this segregated labor market in general. It excludes women, except those in exceptionally favorable circumstances, from occupying elite positions within the production of knowledge. Most women in natural science and engineering are relegated to those tasks that markedly parallel their primary task as wife-mother. Neither chance nor biology explains men's occupancy of the leadership positions within science. Only the most exceptional women from highly privileged class backgrounds, who can therefore transfer their domestic labor to other women, are able to get into science. And even then, they often do so through the personal influence of men, typically husbands, fathers, or lovers. While a patronage is an important mechanism of advancement within science, a woman has a much more narrowly defined set of potential patrons linked to her through her sexuality. Okay? So, strong claims here. The sexual division of labor that you see in science is just happening because that's the division of labor that's in society as a whole. It's not because women are, in some sense, particularly unscientifically inclined. It's not because they're less talented. It's just a carryover from the sexual division of labor we see everywhere else. This is obviously still a flashpoint debate. It is still argued about. There have been controversies in recent years over people making the claim that biology does to some degree determine the sexual division of labor in the sciences, and then researchers firing back with evidence in the other direction. Again, it'd be a good topic for a paper if someone's interested in pursuing it. And then she talks about the difficulty of developing a feminist epistemology. Okay, so again, this claim that you need a specific perspectival epistemology that will be aware of how it is historically and interpersonally grounded, as opposed to a general epistemology that's going to claim to be always applicable. And she talks about a series of materials that have recently become available that are sort of biographies or autobiographies of female scientists that have worked, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, in laboratories largely run by men. And she talks about the fact that many women just withdraw or permit their exclusion, so they don't make it in science because they acquiesce to pressures to drop out. She talks about others who become what she calls honorary men, and whose sort of diaries, whose autobiographies, whose statements then often will deny that being a woman has affected them one way or the other. She runs through various biographical stories and sort of mines them for information about exclusion and differential treatment and how this plays out, and says these are not unique experiences. What's new is that they are discussed. Okay, so you're getting something in the public sphere that used to just be kept private and individualized, that has to do with the treatment of women who are trying to move into scientific spaces. And she says, thus a woman scientist is cut in two. Her involvement with the abstraction of scientific practice as it is developed under capitalism and patriarchy on the one hand, is in painful contradiction with her caring labor on the other. And again, this point pops up, is still popping up in analyses of gender differentials in the sciences, where the differentials are hardest in those sciences where the career trajectory requires high levels of production during traditional childbearing years. Okay? Both the men and the women have children, but the gender division of labor in the household, who generally cares for that child, has a disproportionate career impact in some fields relative to others. Small wonder that women, let alone feminists, working in natural science and engineering are rarities. It's difficult enough to suppress half of oneself to pursue knowledge of the natural world as a woman. It is even more difficult to develop a feminist epistemology. Okay, so it's hard enough to function in the sphere. Those few people who manage to function in it, it's no surprise, Rose thinks, that they've not themselves yet developed a feminist epistemology. Part of that feminist epistemology involves creation of a practice of feeling, thinking, and writing that opposes the abstraction of male and bourgeois scientific thought. And then the goal, you want to reconceptualize science. You want to reconceptualize science using the tools of feminist theory. And the tools of feminist theory, she says, will seek to overcome alienated abstract knowledge by combining both objective and subjective ways of knowing. Okay, so they'll bring to bear, and the Collins from this week talks something similar here, phrases it in a slightly different way, but they'll bring to bear women's concrete experiences in talking about findings in science. There's a shared subjective experience of oppression. And she says the exclusion of women from science paradoxically has offered feminists a fresh page on which to write. Okay, so you can make a positive out of the negative. There's the possibility here to do kind of greenfield work, new work, coming from quite a different space from existing concepts of science, and it's the exclusion that's made that necessary and possible. She says shared personal experience binds together personal, social, and biological phenomena. And she talks about things like menstruation as an example, how you would talk about that, and that it's not a purely biological process. When women are discussing it in feminist circles, they're talking about personal and social dimensions of it as well. And she says that this sort of conversation, this sort of analysis, makes it possible to overcome Cartesian dualism. So the strong divide between the body and the mind is Cartesian dualism. The phrase will come up in a number of readings, this term. Biological determinism, so the idea that what you are is determined by your biology. And social constructionism, the idea that you are a blank slate and can be infinitely malleable and infinitely shaped by society. So she believes that women's experiences indicate that you've got biological things that cannot be socially shaped, that these biological things nevertheless leave quite a wide range of play for what you're going to do. So biological determinism and social constructionism don't work, and yet at the same time they require a blending together of thinking, feeling, and what's going on in the body. So standard forms of Cartesian dualism that say you've got a mind-body distinction that's very strong are also overcome by these kinds of conversations. And she says, in this situation, a feminist biology does not attempt to be objective and external to the female biological entity. It attempts to make over biological knowledge in order to overcome women's alienation from our own bodies, our own selves. And she has in mind there a very famous work, Our Bodies, Ourselves, that's published around this period. And she says there's a need for a critical exploration of caring labor. Bringing caring labor and the knowledge that stems from participation in it to the analysis becomes critical for a transformative program equally within science and within society. And then she uses this phrase that she's taking over from a certain form of Marxism, that the future is dialectically contained within the present. So she doesn't know where the future is going to go or exactly what it's going to hold, but in these sorts of conversations that women are beginning to have in the feminist movement, she thinks there is the beginnings of something that will allow a radically different future than what our past has been.